Once you have your objects modeled and you understand the way lighting works in Maya, you can add color and texture to your objects. And this is basically adding materials. And we use materials to give attributes to a given object or surface. So in order to access all our materials, we're going to use the Hypershade window. And you can access the Hypershade window by clicking on Windows, Rendering Editors, and the Hypershade. Or you can also access the same window by clicking on this button right next to the Render Settings button, this green round ball. And once you have your Hypershade open, I'm going to explain to you the way that this window works. So in this section, you can preview all of the materials that you have in your scene. You can see that right now we only have the default materials because we haven't added any. And then underneath this, we have the Create window where it basically displays all of the materials that Maya has available for you to work with and create. And then we have here our node editor, and we'll look into this node editor once we start creating materials. So if you go to the Create window under Favorites, you should have all of Maya's native materials. And we're going to look into 4 of these native materials from Maya, which are the most common ones that you'll be using. If you are really interested in learning about materials, I encourage you to go through all of the different tabs here and seeing what each one can do. But for this tutorial, we're going to look at Maya's native materials and the ones that you'll be using the most. So we're going to go ahead and create a blend material, and you can see that only by clicking on it, I've added it to my materials library. We're also going to create a Lambert material, so go ahead and click on Lambert. And then we're going to click on Phong and Phong E. So now that we have these in our library, we're going to go through each one and see what these materials look like. So Lambert is the basic default material. You can see here we already had a Lambert 1 in our scene, and this is the material that all of our objects by default have before being assigned a specific material. So I've created this second material called Lambert 2. And you can always rename your materials here so that you keep track of them. For now, I'm just going to keep it to Lambert 2. So let's look at the attributes for this material. And if you see here, this is similar to this attribute editor window. We have the same settings here as here. So once you assign this material to an object, it'll be in your object's attributes. So you'll be able to see the material just by clicking on the object and moving through your attributes tab all the way to the end. You'll see the material that is assigned. So I'm going to click on my candlestick, and then I'm going to click on my Lambert 2. But see, you have to, if I click on Lambert 2, I lose the selection of my candlestick. So let's go back and click on our candlestick, and then hover over Lambert 2 and right-click over this material, and then drag your mouse so that we hover over the Assign Material to Selection. And now you see that my material has changed. If you find this way of assigning a material too uncomfortable, another thing that we can do is just right-click over your object, and then in this menu, we can assign an existing material, and then you would just need to know which material you want to assign to that object. So this is another way of getting around the same process. So let's preview Lambert 2. This is our material viewer, so here you can get a preview of what this material looks like. And these are the properties of this material. So we can edit the color, for example. We can actually go in and be very specific about the color that we want. Right? We can add transparency to this material if we wanted to. And you can also give it a different ambient color, which will change the ambient that's illuminating this material. Or we can give it incandescence. You can add a bump map, which will give it like a rough, it can give it a rough sort of texture, and we'll look into this in the future. But you can see there's very basic properties for this material. It's basically a matte material with no reflectivity. If you press 6 on your keyboard, you can turn your lights off and kind of see your materials better. So now that we've looked into Lambert, let's go and explore Blinn as our second material. So as you can see, the Blinn material starts to have highlights and reflections. So Blinn has specularity. You can see here that we have the same color, transparency, and ambient color and incandescence settings. But now there's another tab that has the specular shading. And you can change the color of these highlights, right? As well as its eccentricity, or the roll-off. You can also change how reflective this material is and the color that it will reflect. I'm going to add this to the base of my lampshade. So it's the Blinn 1 material, right? So we're going to select the base of my lampshade, and then I'm going to right click over Blinn and select Assign Material. Now let's look at Phong. The Phong material is similar to the Blinn, but it behaves a little bit more like plastic. And the way that it does it is that it calculates specular different than Blinn does, but it's a very similar material. So let's go ahead and try out some different settings for Phong, and let's apply this material to another element in our table. Maybe I'm going to work with the apple, and I'm just thinking of like a surreal apple. I don't really need my apple to look like a real apple. Maybe it can even be a bit transparent. So I'm going to click on my apple and assign this Phong material. Now let's look at Phong E. Phong E is more for glass type surfaces. It has more control over the roughness, the size of your highlight, which would be the whiteness, as well as the color. So again, we have the same basic settings, such as color, transparency, ambient color, incandescence, and diffuse. And then we have our specular. So this one, I want to have it with a little bit more roughness. want my color to be a light yellow. And let's go ahead and try add this to maybe our candle. So maybe we want our candle to look something like a glass type of surface. There we go. So we've looked at 1, 2, 3, 4 materials so far. And these are Maya's native materials. Now let's go ahead and try to re-render our scene so we can observe what these materials look like with our lighting settings. So this is looking a little bit better. Another thing to make sure is when you're doing your render preview, make sure this sRGB gamma color correction is off. Maya by default turns it on, but this is really like an extra filter that it adds. So you don't really want to be working with this because it has nothing to do with the settings that you have here. It's kind of like a post-production filter. So it's better to get used to working without this. And this is looking better. I could definitely work with my illumination and make it so that I don't get these strong highlights. But you kind of get an idea of how you can create materials with Maya's default basic materials. Now that we've looked at these 4 materials, we're going to look into Arnold's standard surface shader. So the same way that Maya has its native materials, since we're using Arnold's rendering engine, Arnold also comes with its own materials that work really well with that rendering engine. And so if we go to our Hypershade window and under our Create, select Arnold, you'll see these are all of Arnold's materials. And you can feel free to kind of explore all of them, but we really only need to work with Arnold's standard surface shader. So let's go ahead and look at it. Under Arnold, the easiest thing is to select shader, the submenu shader, and then you'll find it there. So it's AI standard surface. And go ahead and click on it. And so Arnold's standard surface shader can basically transform into many different materials. You can have a material similar to Lambert, or you can have a material that's similar to Phong or Phong-E, because you can change all of these different properties and customize this material. So again, we have our color channel, which we can experiment with. The weight is similar to the diffuse channel, and this one is fine to leave normally at 0.8. We have roughness settings, and we can also control the metalness. So if we want this to be a metallic material, we just need to move this one value up and down. We again have the specular. And right now, since I have a metallic material that's highly reflective, it's hard to tell, but we can change these values the same way we were able to in Blinn. And we can change the roughness. And this is the index of refraction. So different materials have a different value of index of refraction, and there's actually a sheet that you can look up to get the exact material values. For example, if you wanted to make a shader to resemble something like water. We have transmission, which creates a glass-like effect. And we have subsurface scattering, which is to work with things such as skin or wax kind of effects. Skin is like this, if you really looked at skin into detail, it's this semi-transparent material because you can look through your skin and actually see your veins, right? The same thing with wax, it's kind of semi-transparent. And then we have surface coat, which is for things such as car paint or when you have an overcoat with a different color. So you can change this, and you can also change the colors of this upper coat. Let's go ahead and look at geometry. So when you're working with Arnold shaders, if you want materials to be opaque, you need to go under the geometry tab and actually alter the opacity. And try and make a transparent material to add to your lampshade. Remember not to confuse it with the regular standard surface shader. It needs to have the AI letters before it. This means this is the Arnold material. And again, let's go ahead and preview this. I'm gonna maybe make a top view this time. And remember, you can always fine-tune your materials after doing these render tests. If there's things that you don't like and you want to change. I really like the glossiness of this material. It starts to feel like a liquid material over a solid shape.